Oh, tēnā koe. Today we've got DeAnne Bateson with me. She is just going to explain to us some of the Nuremberg Code that has been a hot topic in Aotearoa. So, DeAnne, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Kia ora, Joe. I'm a barrister based in Wellington. I've been invited to come and talk about the status of the Nuremberg Code here in New Zealand and actually what it is, so to tell you a bit about that and what it actually pertains to and how it applies in the research realm in terms of medical research. So,
can you please explain to us what is the Nuremberg Code or the Nuremberg principles?
Sure. So, look, in 1947, after there'd been what they called the doctor's trial, so the Americans had come into Germany, they'd taken control and they conducted trials where they looked at various aspects of the behaviour of the Nazis during the Second World War, particularly in relation to persons in the concentration camps. So the doctor's trial actually related to the inhumane treatment of persons in concentration camps where they were subjected to all sorts of inhumane research, medical research. And that was done against their will, so without consent. That trial found 16 doctors guilty. So you would have seen some photos on the internet of hangings, etc. That's the result of those trials. After hearing the evidence, after hearing witnesses and seeing the photographic evidence and also reviewing all of the research that they undertook, those people were found guilty. Because of the horrors that have been seen and the things that have been done, the research community looked at how we could avoid that as human beings, how we could actually avoid that in the future. And that's when the Nuremberg Code came about. So that was to avoid the horrors of experimentation on persons during any form of trials, whether it's to put their bodies to tests that you would never put a human being through, or extreme pain, testing medication on them, all sorts of things. So there's 10 principles that sort of apply there, Joe, in terms of that, and they're really the first one, the predominant one and the overriding one in terms of these ethics for research is actually about voluntary consent and informed consent, so that people that get involved in trials of medication or trials in terms of putting their body to extreme depth or cold and those sort of things, that they, in order for us to find out about how bodies react to certain things, must actually be consenting and know exactly what they're getting into. So that's one of the fundamental principles. And then after that, there's some really significant ones. And the research itself, well, the experiment that they conduct must actually yield fruitful results, so be good for society. It can't be done by any other method, so you couldn't, for example, do those tests on an animal or someone else. It'd have to be a human being in order to actually do an efficient study. And it certainly looks at whether it's unprocurable by other methods or means of study and not random or unnecessary in the future. So it's got to have utility. The experiment needs to be designed properly and it needs to be measured properly, and you need to actually look after the people that are involved in it. So there's 10 principles that actually mean that you actually have to be really, you've got a duty of care to those people that you're doing experimentation on.
So were these principles brought about because the human experimenting and the war crimes that these doctors were doing in Nazi Germany were actually legal?
Well, the Nazis created their own laws, really. I think what the trials found was that they'd subjected to people to things that other humans would find absolutely abhorrent, and scientists and doctors would find abhorrent. So they undertook all sorts of, I don't even want to describe, Joe, what they did, because they were horrific and they're pretty sensitive in terms of what people would be able to cope with hearing what was done to a pregnant woman and all sorts of people. So it was, we don't want that behaviour again. As human beings, we do not want people subject to those things, those inhumane treatments, without their consent. Because the people in the concentration camps, they were forced to do those things. They were shackled and tied up, and they were experimented on without their consent.
So do the Nuremberg principles, does any of that apply to Aotearoa, New Zealand?
No, in fact, look, the Nuremberg Code is an adopted form of ethics for research across the world, but it hasn't actually been incorporated in any international treaty or any law as such. And in New Zealand, it's not law. So what it is, what you do see is, I think we were talking earlier, that there's a bit of a nod to that in Section 11 of the Bill of Rights Act. But it goes wider, Section 11, because Section 11 says that you have the right to turn down treatment if you don't want to have that. You absolutely have that right. So it doesn't just apply Section 11 to, in the research context, it applies across the board to even, treatments for like blood transfusions, etc., that you can actually say no, you have the right to say no. So we've seen that in New Zealand, where parents have had to be forced by a court order to have their child have a bone marrow transplant or those sort of things. We've seen that happen in the law, that the court's been the ultimate decider of that. So the checks and balances around those things in terms of medical treatment, etc., have always been with the courts, and that they're a fundamental right for you to decline treatment. So we've seen that, right? And the recent cases with the midwives and the teachers, etc., that the discussion around Section 11 and the right to actually refuse vaccination. Yeah. So those sort of things are embedded in our law already as protections to people, that you do have sovereignty and choice over your body about those things. So no, it's not law in New Zealand. It doesn't set up any precedent for any criminal actions against any particular person. It doesn't create a foundation in law for you to be able to go and have a trial of someone, for example, and hold them accountable in terms of those ethical principles that are in the Nuremberg Code.
Are any New Zealand politicians going to be arrested and sent to Germany for trial and possibly hung by a rope?
Well, there's several things embedded in that, Joe, but the first being that, one, there is no crime based on, so in order to be charged, in order to face trial, there must actually be an offence. And it's the Nuremberg Code does not create an offence. It does not create anything by which a police officer could arrest somebody, like a politician. No judge could convict a person in respect of the non-compliance with the Nuremberg Code, because it has no status in law. In terms of going to Germany, while there are international tribunals of human rights and justice, etc., no politician in New Zealand is going to be pulled in front of one of those tribunals, and certainly not in Nuremberg, because Nuremberg was specific to what happened in World War Two. Nuremberg status, or the Nuremberg Code, arises out of where the Americans chose to have those trials. So the other thing, I think we talked about this just before we went on air, is that in any case, Germany doesn't have the death penalty, and nor does New Zealand. So, and so there is no ability to have someone hung after a reasonable trial. I've seen that online, right? Oh, we'll be reasonable and have a trial, and etc. That's just not the case. That would not happen here, and it wouldn't happen in Germany either.
So you believe that New Zealanders, New Zealand politicians being arrested, sent to Nuremberg in Germany to have a noose put around their neck after a trial and hung is highly unlikely?
Highly unlikely. If you take, for example, so UNCAT, look, the for unjust treatment to persons, did make a ruling about Lake Alice, for example. And they said, but all they could do was recommend to the New Zealand government that they actually pay compensation to the people that were harmed at Lake Alice. So the only way that any international body in respect to New Zealand could have any control over New Zealand would be to put sanctions over New Zealand if they didn't comply with any suggestions by an international tribunal body. But no, you're not going to get people put on planes, transported to Germany and facing trial. The other oddity about that anyway is that Germany has had a very similar response to COVID and done very similar things to us. And so I don't know who in Germany is going to be wanting to call our politicians to account for those things, given that the worldwide response. So let's look about, things like the measures we put in place. Lockdowns have been put in place in the UK. They've been put in place in America. They've been put in place in Germany. They're, across the world, Taiwan, everywhere, right? So all of the things that we've done, vaccine passports, nothing new about those. They're not experimental. They don't fall under the Nuremberg Code anyway. You're not experimenting on someone by making them have a vaccine passport. They're not new anyway, Joe. My grandfather had a vaccine passport for polio. There's some people that are still alive in New Zealand now in their 70s and 80s that were locked down for polio as children. So the measures that we've put in place are not actually that outrageous, given that that's what's been used for infectious disease control previously. Vaccination, there have been protests about vaccinations in the past. There were protests about polio vaccinations. There was conspiracy theories during influenza in 1918 and all of the rest, and distrust of government. None of this is new. So if you're thinking that people are going to be called to account for the same atrocities, considering that these things are the same atrocities as what were committed by the Nazi Germans, then that's really disproportionate, because the Nazis were actually experimenting for their own interest on people in very inhumane ways. The guide here is that, rightly or wrongly, look, history might say that they've got some of these things wrong. We might have some of these things wrong, but they were done for no ulterior motive and purpose. They were done for public health measures. So any court, in any case, would weigh up the reasons why, whether there's malice, whether it was unethical, whether all of those things, whether the way that risks were managed were appropriate and effective and should have been put in place. There might be I think there should be an inquiry in the future as to how we've done this and how we've managed COVID, in order to then know in the future that if we were in the same place, how would we do it again? Are there things that we could do better? But that sort of inquiry, a royal commission, etc., is not going to see our politicians rounded up and sent to Germany. It's going to see us as a country about whether or not in future we act quicker, we do things quicker, and we do things better, and are there things that we could do that will protect people?
I hear it's lovely in Nuremberg, Germany this time of year.
Yeah, well, it'll be pretty because there'll be Christmas markets and all that sort of thing, and it'll be snowing. It'll be a white Christmas.
Thank you for joining us, Southern Cross News, DeAnne. Really appreciate your time. Kia ora. Thank you.
You're welcome. Kia ora.